Okay, so picture this, a massive, brand new power plant. It's promising to bring energy, progress, all the good stuff. And it's backed by some of the world's biggest banks, who've all signed on to these global rules designed to protect people and the planet. Sounds like a pretty solid system, right? A safety net to make sure development doesn't cause a disaster. Well, this is the story of what happens when that safety net completely falls apart.
So this is where our story takes place. We're looking at the coastal Gujarat power plant in India. And really, this one map from the official audit tells you almost everything you need to know. You see this right here? That's the power plant. And over here you have the local villages, Madhva and Trigadi. Now look at this whole area marked in red. That's what they call a thermal plume, basically a huge cloud of dangerously hot water being pumped out from the plant. And it's headed straight for crucial lobster breeding grounds, sea turtle nesting sites, and traditional fishing zones. It's a collision course between massive industry and a local way of life that's been there for centuries.
And the cost for that community? It was devastatingly real. We're talking about the destruction of mangroves. Those are like the vital nurseries for all the marine life there. That hot water is threatening the very places where lobsters breed, and it's putting endangered sea turtle nesting sites in serious danger. You know, those traditional fishing areas, the pagadia, they were thrown into chaos. And the local fisher people, who depended on that water for generations, well, their entire livelihood was suddenly at risk.
So you have to ask, how could this possibly happen? How does a project with such obvious damaging risks get the funding from the world's biggest banks? To get that, we need to take a look at the global rulebook they were all supposed to be playing by. Okay, so the first layer of this so-called safety net is something called the Ecuador Principles. It's basically a pact, a promise, made by over 100 of the world's biggest financial institutions. They all voluntarily agree to follow this framework to make sure the huge projects they're funding, think power plants, dams, pipelines, don't end up causing a ton of harm to the environment or to local communities. It's their public pledge to be responsible lenders.
And here's how it's supposed to work. It's like a chain of responsibility. First, the banks sign on to the Ecuador Principles. Simple enough. Second, those principles require them to make sure their projects follow a very detailed set of rules from the International Finance Corporation. That's the IFC, the part of the World Bank that lends to the private sector. And third, those IFC standards demand a super thorough environmental and social impact assessment before any money changes hands. It's a chain designed to catch problems before they even start.
And the goal here, you got to admit, is pretty incredible. The rules are meant to be, and I'm quoting the standard itself, the basis for building strong, constructive, and responsive relationships. It's all about communication, about respect, about managing the impact together. It's a beautiful idea on paper, but as we're about to see, there is a massive canyon between the words on the page and the reality on the ground.
So where did this perfect system fail? Well, an independent investigation eventually came in and dug into exactly what went wrong. And what they uncovered was just a cascade of failures at nearly every single step of the process.
The very first breakdown was the most basic one. The rule IFC Performance Standard 1 says you have to identify all the people who might be affected using proper social data. But the reality, the official audit found a complete absence of social baseline data for the seasonal fisher people, the very group most at risk. The IFC, the lender, just completely failed to make sure its client even knew who they were about to harm. They were basically invisible.
And of course, if you don't even know who's being affected, you can't possibly consult with them, right? The rule requires effective consultation that starts early on. But the audit found that what happened was neither effective or timely. The community whose lives were being turned upside down had no real voice in the process. The system just wasn't listening.
Now let's jump over to the environmental side. The IFC has this very specific, very technical rule. The water coming out of the plant cannot raise the sea temperature by more than 3 degrees Celsius once you get outside a small mixing zone. It's a hard limit, a line in the sand, designed specifically to protect all the marine life.
But here's the part that's just unbelievable. The project's own computer models predicted it would break this rule. The thermal plume was projected to stretch out over a massive 8 square kilometers, and like we saw on that first map, it was going to smother those sensitive ecosystems. The risks were right there in their own data, but they were not dealt with before the loans were approved and the construction began.
And finally, this project wasn't happening in a bubble. The rules clearly state you have to look at the cumulative impact, the combined effect of your project plus any other big developments nearby. But the audit found the IFC paid inadequate attention to the giant Adani power plant and the Mundra port right next door. They just failed to see the bigger picture, where all these projects were adding up and compounding the damage.
So after years and years of complaints from the local fishing community, an independent watchdog finally got involved, and its verdict was absolutely damning.
That watchdog is the CAO, the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman. You can kind of think of it as the internal affairs division for the IFC. Its whole job is to be an independent voice, to investigate complaints from communities, and to hold the World Bank's private lending arm accountable to its own dang rulebook. So here it is, the core of their conclusion. The CAO found that the IFC's review of the project's environmental and social plans was, and I quote, not commensurate with risk. In plain English, for a project this huge, with risks this obvious, the IFC's level of scrutiny wasn't even close to good enough. They completely dropped the ball.
And the audit just laid out this whole laundry list of failures. The IFC's review process was weak. They missed clear chances to push for better project designs that could have avoided some of the harm. The promises the power company made were written so vaguely they were almost impossible to monitor. And by the time the IFC finally got around to engaging with the community's complaints, it was way, way too late.
So, one power plant in India. Why does this single story have such global importance? What can we really learn from this huge gap between the promise of protection and what actually happened on the ground?
Well, here's the fundamental takeaway from this whole mess. Having global standards like the Ecuador Principles looks fantastic on paper, but they are only as strong as their enforcement. Without rigorous due diligence, without constant monitoring, and without real, painful accountability, these rules risk becoming nothing more than a PR exercise, a way to provide cover for harmful projects instead of actually preventing them.
And that leaves us with a really critical question. In this world of global finance, where money is flying across borders and huge projects are impacting local lives, what happens when the rules fail? Who truly has the power to hold these massive institutions accountable and make sure that the price of progress isn't always paid by the most vulnerable people?